Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss imposter syndrome. Reid reveals his dislike of this term as we discuss its origins, the many ways it manifests, and what to do about it. Hey, if you know somebody in your life who struggles with imposter syndrome, then send them this episode. Everybody loves getting a podcast recommendation from friends that imply they have problems. Thank you for your emails and for your YouTube comments. If you want to reach out to us with episode suggestions or questions, you can email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. And if you want to interact with Reid or myself on social media, you can find us on Instagram. Reid is at Interspace Doctor. I am at Dr. Steve Thayer. All right, without further ado, please enjoy us struggling through our own imposter syndrome. Questions for our listeners. Do you agonize over even the smallest mistakes or flaws in your work? Do you attribute your success to luck or outside factors? Are you very sensitive to even constructive criticism? Do you feel you will inevitably be found out as a fraud or a phony? Do you downplay your own expertise, even in areas where you are genuinely more skilled than the average person? If you answered yes to any of these questions, you might have imposter syndrome. How you doing, Reid?
Pretty good, except to be honest, I'm not a fan of the term imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. I like to go back to when it was first coined, and it was imposter phenomenon, because it's such a common thing. Mm-hmm. Like the latest stat I saw from the APA in a reference was 82% of people identify with that. And if we call it a syndrome, it implies that needs to be fixed. Mm-hmm. But I think in this discussion, we may get into the forces at play and what to do about it, what's really going on underneath the hood of this imposter term. Right. Yeah. So like we usually do when we have an episode that's around a particular kind of either syndrome or condition or phenomenon, we like to try to define it. Yeah. So this one's fairly face valid. Imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome. It's the feeling like you are a fraud or that you will be found out to be an imposter in some domain of your life, yeah? It's essentially self-doubt.
Right. So, but I think there is kind of a social anxiety aspect to it. There's doubt coupled with the fear of being found out, do you think? I mean,
Yeah, I think those are the two main features.
Right.
Yeah. Feeling undeserving, like what you've accomplished is either due to luck or
outside forces. Yeah. Like it's that attribution problem.
Mm-hmm. And then fear of being exposed as a result. But I think the other interesting thing about it is that it seems to be trending, the term. Like I think I've just noticed it showing up more and more in Psychology Today articles, in Vanity Fair articles, in
TikTok videos.
Yeah. And as things do, when we hear about them, especially very common things like that, we start to identify with it. Mm-hmm. And attached to it in some ways. And that can be good or bad. I think there's actually a positive kind of evolutionary underpinning to imposter syndrome, imposter feelings, and it can go awry and become negative, self-limiting.
Yeah. Let's play around with that. So, you bristled at the labeling of it as a syndrome. And I kind of have similar feelings, mm-hmm. in part because oftentimes we will over-pathologize what are probably fairly normative phenomenon, right? Especially when it comes to feelings. We talk a lot about emotions and the normalization of emotions on this podcast. You and I are both mental health professionals, and we've been mm-hmm. trained and have experience with when emotional states, cognitive states, reach the threshold of mm-hmm. what we might call an illness or at least self-defeating.
How much does it interfere with your life?
Right. How functionally impairing is it?
Because a little bit of self-doubt, it can be helpful. It can help you check the right boxes so you show up in an optimal way. Like if you check your lock once at night before going to bed, that can be adaptive towards your survival, depending on what neighborhood you live in, right? If you check it 100 times, it eats into your sleep and it's maladaptive. Or checking the airplane in a pre-flight way, systematically, carefully, being a little bit anxious about it can be good, so you don't crash. But when we start to obsess over it, that's why your initial questions rung some perfectionism bells in me. Like there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, and we find that traits like perfectionism and neuroticism, anxiety, self-preoccupation, low trait levels of self-esteem tend to correlate with people who report experiencing imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome.
Yeah. What do you like better? Imposter phenomenon was what it was called when, what was it, Chance?
Yeah, back in the 70s?
78, when it was first described. But I've heard it more recently called imposter feelings.
I like imposter feelings because of, like we're talking about, that it takes it out of the realm of pathology. When you think of a syndrome, you're thinking of something that's like an illness or the Pixar character. But and makes it more universal and destigmatizes it, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think, like you're implying, Reid, it makes it possible to see it for everything that it might be. There might be situations in which it could be adaptive to be thoughtful about how would we put it? I don't know that I would say it's adaptive to feel like an imposter, but it might be adaptive to be thoughtful about how confident you ought to be in a particular situation, especially if it prompts you to sharpen your skills or to prepare well.
And it also makes sense. I feel that it's completely normal to have some feelings of being an imposter at some point during one's development, especially as we progress, because look at the chasm as a kid between you and grown-ups. Like you're like, whoa, they can drive a car. Whoa, they can tell the plumber what to do. They can like get on an airplane with business colleagues and go to a freaking meeting. Things I cannot do as a 7-year-old.
Right.
And then I think we can either gain a sense of like belief that anything's possible, or we can fester in self-doubt and we can follow that fork in the road to infinity. But the beautiful thing is we can also reshape it as we gain awareness to it at whatever point in our lives.
Yeah, I like that you're talking about it in terms of development, because you could look at imposter feelings as a good sign that you're putting yourself into areas where you're stretching.
Yeah.
Right. If you're always feeling 100% confident about your abilities in every situation that you're in, you might be a narcissist, or you might be completely naive, or you're putting yourself in easy scenarios. You're playing on easy mode, and you don't really grow or develop a lot on easy mode. Growth happens in that really difficult space between what's unrealized and the comfort zone, and we call that space pain. That's the discomfort of growth.
Tension. Yeah. And I asked Hannah for her opinion, our favorite parts work colleague and podcast guest, among other things. And she said something I found profound, is that from a parts work perspective, imposter syndrome, when she's done some personal work on it, she could see as a part of her that's quite common or normal, that you could almost see as a positive sign or a cheerleader, like you were saying, of like, wow, I'm getting somewhere. There may be some naysaying noise that's coming out of that part, but it is a sign that you've progressed to new realms, and discomfort is a part of life.
Right. Yeah, so a lot of it's the perspective you take as you encounter the feelings, which we could say about almost anything, about whether or not it's going to be adaptive or maladaptive. Because certainly I've had imposter feelings or cognitions, beliefs that I am an imposter, that I'm a fraud, that I don't know enough, I'm not enough of an expert, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Perfectionism shows up, that result in me contracting. Like, don't expose yourself. It's that social anxiety part we're talking about, because you're going to get found out, you're going to get embarrassed, you're going to fail, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I've had the more adaptive response as well, where I'm preparing for something, let's say it's a presentation, and I'm feeling like, oh man, I don't think I'm the guy for this. I don't think I know enough. And so that prompts me to then prepare more.
Yeah.
And certainly there's such a thing as over preparing, but or preparing so much that you don't get enough sleep that then you don't perform well, that kind of thing. It needs to be imbalanced.
That's been the bane of my existence sometimes. I'm just remembering late night cramming for exams, and even in more recent years, late night making slides for a presentation where I had procrastinated a bit. And there was a sense of, oh no, I'm going to get up there in front of 500 people and make a fool out of myself. And that fuels some work. And ideally you've left some preparation time for that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's lots of trendy phrases around, preparation, and like luck is where opportunity meets preparation, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's important to sort of ride that edge between over prepare and under prepare. But if you're checking in and you constantly hear the voice, you're not enough, you're not enough, you're not enough, you're not enough. Mm-hmm. Get curious about that voice, right? This might be maladaptive, but as we're trying to describe, if you can, from a parts work perspective, develop a better relationship with that voice, understand what it's trying to protect you from, thank it for its efforts, put it in a more adaptive role, it could help you grow.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. Because your opinion of yourself matters. It does. And, things, it's actually, what we believe that matters and fuels our actions, not necessarily what is factually happening in the environment around us that we may not even notice.
Yeah. We may not even notice, and sometimes it's really hard to get a sense for what's factually happening in the environment around us. We all view the objective world through the lens of our experience, right?
Yeah.
And our beliefs and our expectations. And we have a lot of control over the shape and hue of that lens. But a lot of it's predetermined by our genetic lineage, epigenetics, by our experiences growing up, by the people we surround ourselves by now. So to the extent, you folks, you probably have more control than you think to create your world. That's why the power of positive thinking is so powerful. But I like the power of realistic thinking, just a splash of rosy in there, a splash of positivity.
And as we've said a million times before, these triggers, these struggles are friends to follow and point us towards the work.
Right.
In fact, when an imposter feeling comes up, personally or in people I'm working with, I like to see it as a beautiful opportunity to get underneath the hood and work on that, whatever is underneath that mechanism fueling that self-limiting belief. And I like to do it with, a series of questions. We can even try it if you want. Yeah. Do you have any self-doubts?
Of course not.
Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, let me think for a second. I often struggle with some perfectionistic type self-doubt. So I am not going to measure up. Like I'm not going to be good enough at
might mess up
X, Y, or Z. Yeah, I might make a mistake.
Okay. And is there any rational reason for such a belief?
I think there are some. I've made mistakes in the past. That comes to mind. So yeah, I've got some evidence to suggest that I might fail.
And is it possible that you're mistaken in this belief, depending on what the belief is? Like if you were to state it in its most extreme form, like I'm doomed, I'm going to fail.
I'm going to come, what would be the most extreme form? I'm being deliberately vague, but, I will turn everybody off. I'll be found out to be a horrible person and everyone will leave me. I'll be completely alone.
And so is there a chance that you're mistaken in this belief? Could it be?
Yeah, there's a chance.
And so would you come to the same conclusion about someone else? A client of yours, a friend, or if I came to you and shared a similar belief about another person in a similar situation?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So why should you continue to act and feel the same way about yourself if there is no good reason to believe it as an absolute, or you're you wouldn't apply that same logic to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, you've painted me into a corner, and now I can't say anything other than I wouldn't, right? There's no reason to continue believing this, which is often what happens when we have these sort of cognitive, sort of a CBT type approach to helping people see the irrationality behind their irrational thoughts.
Create some dissonance, right?
And which creates insight often for people.
Yeah, you can use that tension again to fuel like reshaping those thoughts. Like they are, that's the beauty of it. Like we were saying, they are, we can shift our perspective. We can go from a fixed to a growth mindset. We can go from limiting self-belief to limitless potential.
I appreciate you running me through that exercise, because I love the insight of why do you treat yourself differently than you would treat anybody else? Like, why is there that exception there?
Yeah, that hit me hard when I started working in the eating disorder world. And I know that's a unique example and a particularly sticky one, or it can be difficult to shake off or let go of. But self-image is so fascinating to me because we don't give ourselves the grace that we give others. And it does matter how we view ourselves.
It's one of the reasons I've loved combining parts work that we've talked so much about recently on the podcast and cognitive behavioral approaches.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the main or common approaches when you start doing eating disorder work is one big parts work exercise. Have you heard the book, Your Life Without Ed?
No.
It's like almost mandatory reading when someone goes into a course of treatment, where they personified the eating disorder voice as this dude named Ed. And how would your life be without that voice? Or separating your true capital S self from that voice saying you're not good enough, or you're this or that, or you need to lose weight or change the way you look or something like that.
Right. I love that. I love personifying the negative voice, and it's a form of parts work, right? Because a lot of times, especially when I've worked with people with eating disorders or OCD, people on that end of the entropic brain spectrum, that are more over-controlled, you do the CBT thing, but they tend to be like really, really resistant to being convinced, which I know maybe the CBT ardents would disagree that that's what we're doing, but being convinced that their beliefs are irrational, or they'll admit it, like with OCD, but then they still feel like they're slaves to it. But I've found that, like, doing that, being able to compartmentalize it and say, this is just your OCD talking. This is just Ed talking. It makes it a lot more accessible. Like, you can approach it with a little less defensiveness.
Gives you something to work with. And sometimes, in order to see that or get a radical change of perspective, we give a sprinkle of psychedelics, right? And sometimes we use the neuroplasticity in a psychedelic to melt some of the rigidity, like we've talked about in the past around the theory of rebus and how psychedelics work, relax beliefs under psychedelics to loosen the grip of those tightly held self-limiting beliefs.
Yeah. So in as much as imposter beliefs or feelings or syndrome or phenomenon are beliefs, then it stands to reason that they could be helped with psychedelic treatment.
Yeah, and one of the other reasons why I cringe a tiny bit when I hear imposter syndrome thrown around so much, rather than like imposter feelings is because I believe there's a big systemic root of it. Like there's a societal cultural issue where if we put it as a syndrome on someone and say, you've got a problem, you need to fix it, but it really stems in part, at least, from how we interrelate in society and these filtered lives we share out there, and how we don't really know each other's internal struggles as much, and we might think we're alone or an imposter in this when so many other people are having the same phenomenon.
It's a good point, Reid. we live in a very weird time. I'm sure every adult at every epoch has said we live in a really weird time, but the fact that we are constantly exposed to airbrushed and photoshopped versions of people's lives, it shapes our expectations for what our lives should be. I think it's one reason why people simultaneously will love and follow the airbrushed and photoshopped versions of people's lives, but also really, really like authenticity. That's one of the reasons why I love podcasts, conversation podcasts, because we have our notes in front of us, but Reid and I would be having a conversation just like this if the cameras were off. Like, this is how we talk to each other about specific topics. And so it shows a certain kind of intimacy and vulnerability, and we don't heavily edit it. I mean, if I fart really loud, maybe Jamie will edit it out, but maybe we should just have a podcast where it's just us burping and farting. People would love that kind of authenticity, Reid.
Let's test that theory.
Maybe we will.
But this is an unfiltered podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think you're right. It's as I neglect to sip my caffeinated beverage, speaking of unfiltered. Well, I've lost my train of thought, but say more about what you're getting at here with how we all feel this to some degree.
Yeah, so I think one other point I wanted to make is that there's a trap in just assuming that mantras and self-esteem alone will fix the problem. And there's also a risk in just going into therapy or coaching to fix imposter syndrome when it's so common out there and is a byproduct of some of the societal issues around us, especially for marginalized groups. There's even studies that show it gets worse. Like if you're a woman in corporate America in certain positions that are predominantly male, like it's more likely to show up. Unfortunately, it shows like the kind of some of the patriarchal problems out there in leadership roles in corporate America. But interestingly, like I think we could chat a little bit about self-esteem versus self-compassion in how you might approach some of this, like because self-esteem or confidence alone isn't necessarily the answer, and there's even studies to show that a compassionate, like forgiving oneself, giving oneself grace for making mistakes and understanding and just learning from them and kind of metabolizing that and moving forward and doing better next time is actually a more productive path.
That's something I've been really happy to learn as a child of the 1980s who was raised on a healthy diet of self-esteem. Like that's when the self-esteem movement was in full force. You're a special snowflake. You can do anything you want. Here's a participation trophy. No one should feel bad about themselves. If anything, that's kind of a recipe for imposter syndrome because you're told these are all the wonderful things you are. And then you enter adulthood where the world isn't nerfed by your parents anymore. If you had over-controlling and overprotected parents, either helicopter, lawnmower, or snowplow, pick your, machine metaphor.
Yeah.
But yeah, you are all of a sudden in this world that isn't confirming these things about you, and you become really, really nervous. I thought I was supposed to be X, Y, or Z. I was supposed to be the star student. And now that's where that perfectionism shows up. And I think it can be a product of putting too much emphasis on self-esteem and not enough on it's okay to be imperfect. Self-compassion is the salve.
Yeah. And a little dose of like loving, honest authenticity. Because there are two extremes in this example of parenting that you bring up that I think is important. Like if you, on the one end, just tell a kid that, oh, you're the best singer in the universe. Like you can be anything. You can be a singing butterfly on the top charts, and then they go try out for American Idol and they have never got a real lesson, and they might not be starting with some inborn talent, and they just get thrashed. Like,
right.
and their self-image plummets, versus the other end of the spectrum. Do you remember in the 4 Agreements, an example of, I think it's in being impeccable with your word or something like that, where there's a mom working 2 or more jobs, super stressed out of her window of stress tolerance, and the kid is singing, and she just comes unhinged and says, "Stop singing, you're the worst singer ever," and the kid never sings again. And so there's a middle ground there, right? Of course, of like lovingly encouraging and honoring the kid's journey wherever they're at, and instilling in them this belief in oneself and ability to not be limited by doubts, knowing you can learn and grow, but being realistic about the work and the journey.
Yeah. I think, again, it's another testament to why compassion and validation are a better approach than just deluding yourself or someone that it's okay, you're great, you're great, you're great. Certainly we need to be told that we are lovable humans and that we're capable of much, and that our efforts to promote that growth mindset that you referred to will be met with rewards, but not exclusively. Sometimes you fail. Sometimes things don't turn out the way you expect. That is okay. You are okay in the sense that you are not bad because it didn't work out. You might not feel great. That is also okay. Yeah, it just reminds me of the approach that I've tried to take as a parent and as a therapist with my clients of validation and encouragement, but also a healthy yin-yang balance of, and you done screwed up. Like, it's okay to take a hard look at what you did and confront and accept where you fell short. That's also like my high school football military background too. There wasn't a whole lot of soft serving of that kind of feedback.
Yeah, and I think I keep remembering the book on mindset, what Carolyn Dweck, that we could put in the show notes, because I think that's one superpower we can work to instill in young people and ourselves is adopting that growth mindset rather than a self-limiting fixed one. That can go a long way.
Yeah. Is it Angela Duckworth that wrote Grit? And I always get Duckworth and Dweck mixed up because the mindset and grit are so similar. And I think Duckworth co-hosts No Stupid Questions with Stephen Dubner.
Yeah, it was Dweck who did Mindset.
Okay. Yeah.
The internet will check us.
Yeah. Please comment below.
Please be nice in your comments.
You know what? Be as mean as you want. I can take it.
Steve got a hater, and that means he's famous.
I know. Like the first just completely unnecessary, out of left field, unkind comment about the way I look, which may or may not have prompted this.
What if we're one collective organism and that was just one little part of you saying
that? You just blew my mind. It's that, it reminds me of that meme I shared with you once, was like, if we are all just God, experiencing himself, then, if I have sex with my partner, am I having sex with myself?
Trippy thoughts.
It's trippy thoughts for Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers.
I don't know if it's related, but I'm just remembering that Ram Dass quote about we're all just God and drag.
It would make sense. Yeah.
So, all right. What to do about it? Because our beliefs matter. They can become habits, even behavioral habits, and we need to dehypnotize ourselves from this state of self-limiting beliefs and this head full of doubt.
Yeah, I think like with so many of these things, if there is a step one, it's pay attention.
Awareness, self-awareness.
Yeah.
And I should back up a little bit because I feel a little bit bad for knocking on the term imposter syndrome, because I'm a huge fan of self-awareness. And when there's a rating scale, I like to take it. I like to do it. I like to dish it out. And who is it? Pauline Chance, who coined the term imposter phenomenon. She also created what's it called? The Clance Imposter Phenomenon Scale. That's freely available out there. I don't know if that's what you're reading questions from.
I don't think so.
But there are 20 questions that I think are very useful. Just don't identify with having a sick syndrome, right? Do it in the light of self-awareness.
Well, and we've said this before when we talked about diagnoses in particular, or generally, I guess, on the podcast, but don't over-identify with any label.
Yeah.
I mean, there can be something relieving about, finding out that there's a thing that explains why you feel shitty. I get that.
Yeah.
I remember, in graduate school, one of my professors, when talking to us about sort of the constructed way that we came about with mental illness labels, he said, I had a client who showed all the signs and symptoms of feeling depressed. And when I told him, hey, you have major depressive disorder, he smiled. His countenance beamed. You're right, I'm depressed. Mm-hmm. It was the least depressed I ever saw him, was when I told him he was depressed. So, it's not necessary to over-identify with a label, although knowing that there's something that might explain how you've been feeling can feel comforting. Just want to throw that out there with respect to labels.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
So we were talking about what to do about it, right? And I think maybe talking a little bit more about the different ways in which imposter feelings manifest can help us understand what to do about it. So in the spirit of awareness, we talked about perfectionism, it can show up as perfectionism.
Perfectionism is a lie, by the way.
Right.
Just remembering that, celebrating the achievements in oneself and in each other. I think we can all do more of that. Something I'm trying to work on is just like when I have these thoughts of someone's done a great job, like trying to speak them, share them sincerely, like the real ones.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That does a lot. It does a lot to heal yourself and others. Encouraging
each other. There's enough of the naysaying going on out there, enough haters on the internet. Let's all encourage each other for a change.
In the spirit of encouragement, Reid, that's something I've noticed a lot about you. Something I'm learning from you is I am a natural skeptic and I can be pretty critical. I've done a lot of work around that, but that's something I've noticed about you is when both paths are available to you, the critical path and the complementary path, I see you often choosing the latter.
Well, thank you. Are you just modeling, giving compliments?
I'm not just modeling. It's also...
Oh, I just felt like an imposter.
You totally deflected. This is great.
We're spilling it on the table here.
Yeah.
No, but thank you for that.
Of course.
That does mean a lot. And I heard Brene Brown once in one of her books talk about how frustrating it was that her husband just believes people are good naturally and that she tended to see like the potential negative, and it took her a minute to work through that.
I remember that conversation, and she even said that when she asked her husband, like, why do you do that? Why do you believe the best in people? And he said something to the effect of, I like myself better when I believe other people are doing the best they can. And I just thought that was a cool take on it. Her husband's name is Steve, by the way.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Nice. Fun fact. But it is such a delightful thing to occur in one's life to recognize your own worth and to see it in others. Like there's a lot of joy in that.
One thing I've noticed about some of the like hard chargers that I work with, the quote unquote high performers, and I do the quote unquote thing because sure, they might accomplish a lot of things and tasks and accumulate lots of wealth or whatever, but they often do so at a great cost to their soul, and they're often fueled by what I call dirty fuel. It's, you can look at some of their accomplishments, the size of their accomplishments proportionate to the size of the hole in their heart they're trying to fill. Yeah. This, great chasm in their soul that they're trying to fill. And you find that imposter syndrome is often responsible, or feelings or perfectionism or whatever. Some feeling of not being enough is at the root of a lot of that. And a lot of when I help these folks develop awareness around there, they'll say, well, if I let go of that, I'll lose my edge. Like I won't be able to accomplish as much as I'm accomplishing.
Maybe. And is life about how much you accomplish?
Right.
You know who had a great conversation about that recently? You may have heard it. Tim Ferriss on his podcast talking to...
Is it Cal Newport?
No, the gal who wrote Melancholy and Introverts.
Susan Cain.
Yes. Yeah, that was a beautiful conversation. And it's an episode within the last few months. about her book that recently came out that I'm just loving, by the way, Melancholy, I think it's called. But they went off on this tangent about how they see each other, and Tim was just reflecting. They were both reflecting on how in the past he was much more driven by these shadows or the hole in his heart, and why he's shifted more towards what he does, like the content of his podcast, the pursuits of his philanthropy, when more he was in this startup grind.
Right, angel investing and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed about him and a couple other folks like him that I've been following since I was a younger man. I'm still young, Reid, in spite of the gray in my beard. Yeah, is this transition. And psychedelics is part of that transition for a lot of them, incidentally. And I don't know that it's too incidental. It's probably responsible for a lot of that type of wisdom and awareness and transition into less grinding, less proving, less protecting, and more serving and slowing down, being more thoughtful and deliberate. When you feel whole, you're not as tempted to fill holes.
Yeah. Yep. I don't know why I'm thinking about it, or if it's even relevant. All these tangents today.
Love it.
But have you read Zarathustra, however you pronounce it, by Nietzsche?
I don't pronounce it either. No.
Where there are 3 stages of human development. And the first one, I think, is like a camel, where like humans at this stage of development just sit there and moan, like powerless or just fighting or bickering. And then there's this lion phase, like you're a rebel. You're maybe transcending that imposter syndrome and saying, I can do what I want, or I deserve to be here and I'm going to break the rules. But then the third phase, interestingly, is a child reborn, where like it's a fresh newness. And then what do you really want to like manifest or affirm in your life, or like what does a parent really want for their young child? Yeah.
I think that tracks pretty well with like Ericksonian stages of human development, generativity and all that. Yeah, I like that. I feel like that's sort of the trajectory that my life has taken so far. So I can certainly relate.
Yeah. Yeah. Reborn. It's a part of a lot of spiritual paths too. Like even in like Christianity, there's a rebirth or born again. There's awakenings in Eastern spiritual paths. That's similar.
Yeah, it's a theme that comes up.
Yeah. But I guess, the takeaway for me is just, can we, say yes to more kind of positivity in our life, more deserving, more self-worth, more, less doubt. Yeah. And can we encourage ourselves and each other more along the way?
I think one of the things that has helped me do that more is believing that everything is going to be okay one way or another.
Yeah.
That of course I'm an imposter because no one's perfect, but guess what? Everyone else is too. You have this funny spotlight effect where you think everyone's looking at you, these kind of social anxiety issues, that everyone's smarter than you, doing better than you. They are in some ways because we all have strengths and weaknesses, and they aren't in other ways.
Yeah.
And the people that you look at and worship and think are perfect, if they've made any decisions different from you, it's been the decision to be more confident or at least to display their best as often as they can. Don't compare your worst to their best.
Yeah, that's wise advice.
Well, thanks, Reid.
Thank you, Steve. It's been fun.
Indeed. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.